We are now going to move on to discussing macromolecules a little further. We're going to talk specifically how macromolecules aid in the energy of living things. So let's start off by talking about what is energy. We've heard the word, most of you probably think of electricity, but when we're talking about in general, energy is the ability to do work. So movement of any kind, the ability to do work. And it is measured in joules or calories. Now, when we're talking about living things, we need to know that cells have to have energy. Now, you might be thinking, okay, why would a little cell need energy? Cells need energy to build molecules, to move, to remove waste, and to bring in nutrients. Each little cell is like a whole body, so it's doing a lot of work all the time, and it needs energy to do that work. Now, as we talk about energy, it's really important to discuss the law of conservation of energy, because this is really, really important. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Okay, so energy just doesn't poof appear out of nowhere. It has to come from something else. It's never created and it's never completely destroyed. That energy is transferred from one thing to another. It's converted from one thing to another. So we've talked about that each and every cell of all living things has to use energy. We talked about why it needs to do that. But you need to know that living things must be able to convert that energy from one form to another. So we're going to talk about consumers and we're going to talk about producers. So first off, how do consumers obtain that usable energy? Answer, through food. Okay, so they eat food of some sort in the form of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And through consuming that food, they're able to obtain that usable energy. Now, when we talk about energy, we're going to go into detail of where that energy is found, how it's stored. So I just want to give you a little reminder that as you're going through these notes, you can pause at any time. You can add little extra stars on the side, ask questions that you can bring up in class to put on the question wall, so on and so forth. But you need to know that all molecules store energy in the bonds between the atoms. The energy in molecules is released by breaking the bonds between those atoms. So imagine kind of like an Easter egg. When you break apart that Easter egg, out spills the candy. That's exactly what's going on with these chemical bonds. The energy is stored in those bonds, so as soon as we break it apart, that energy is released. Now, when the bonds are formed between the atoms, the energy is stored. So that's kind of like preparing the Easter eggs, where you put the candy inside of them, you close them, you're storing that energy for later. Now, the major energy source used by all cells is a carbohydrate called glucose. And to do work, cells must be able to convert glucose into what's called ATP. ATP is our Easter egg. That's the spot where we're storing that energy. So here you can see an image of glucose. I know it looks a little complicated. There's lots of letters there, but if you pay close attention, all you can find is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's all that's there, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And it's just arranged in a certain way that is able to store that energy that we can convert and put into ATP. So we've talked about consumers and how they will convert food into glucose to be able to store an ATP. But how do producers obtain their usable energy? Remember, these aren't consumers. They don't eat anything. So how do those producers obtain their energy? The answer? Photosynthesis. They use sunlight to convert that energy, the sunlight energy, and go through photosynthesis to convert sunlight into glucose. When we have glucose and we're going to store it in ATP, this is what that looks like. Okay, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. I know big words, but remember we can break it down. Adenosine is the front section. Okay, that's found right here. This is adenosine. triphosphate. Tri means three, three phosphates. Okay, so here's each of the three P's. Adenosine triphosphate. This is the primary source of energy used by cells to do work. It's the batteries of the cells. Now, the way that we release the energy is to break that bond with the last P. So when the last phosphate is removed, energy is released. We start out with ATP here on the left. Remember, adenosine triphosphate. We'll break the bond at this last P right here. And as soon as we break it off, out pops the energy. The molecule that we're left with is called ADP. Okay, adenosine diphosphate. Di meaning two. So, see, we're left with two P's. That's where the diphosphate comes from. So we know that the energy in ATP comes from the glucose. When we get the glucose converted, we're going to take that energy from the food and store it in the chemical bonds of ATP. And this is how we're going to fill those Easter eggs. We're going to have a molecule of ADP. So here we have our adenosine right here and our two phosphates. We insert the energy, okay, into that bond with the last P. As soon as we put that energy right there, the last P will attach and form ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now I'm going to leave you with a little question before we go to kind of make you think here. If I told you that the energy is stored in the chemical bonds, how would you answer this question? Why do lipids have more energy per gram than carbohydrates? Okay, because lipids do. Lipids have more energy per gram than carbohydrates. And just a reminder, if the energy is stored in those bonds, what would cause lipids to have more energy than carbohydrates? So I want you to pause the video, I want you to write down what you think, and then we'll see how smart you really are. Okay, so you should have paused the video and write down your answer, and I bet you did awesome because you guys are smart kids. You should have written that lipids have more chemical bonds than carbohydrates because they do. That's where the energy is stored, so if you have more chemical bonds, you'll have more energy.